Chapter 12. Devon, Merrillmar House. Mr. Flint, the estate manager, was sitting in a comfy chair smoking his pipe, with Boo, Merrillmar's giant Bouvier de Flandre. He watched Mrs. Flint studiously move around the long table in the grand dining room, straightening the linen tablecloth and laying it for two. Whilst gripping the end of his pipe between an excellent set of teeth, he frowned before remarking, "I'm just saying it would be nice to have more notice before she turns up, that's all." "More notice?" Mrs. Flint bridled at the very suggestion, her West Country burr very much in evidence. "It's her bleeding house, innit? Besides, I loves it when she comes down. In my opinion, she doesn't come down often enough." "Where is Mr. Baxter?" "Henry," she corrected herself. "Still in London at Lamethyst. Neath mentioned he had some loose ends to tie up. Shame, really," he ruminated. "I would have asked him to come lobster potting tomorrow." "There's no doubt he would have loved that," she bristled. "And I'm not saying I mind. We've all got to eat, that's for sure. But it's a bit inconsiderate, don't you think?" "Not really. You can't get all bent out of shape because you choose to have a lobster for a pet." Knowing it was a sensitive subject, he tried to change the course of the conversation. "Have you fed the General today?" "Course I fed him. Look at the flippin' size of him," she continued, mumbling under her breath. "Costing me a flippin' fortune in crabs," adding seriously, "He's not a pet. He's family. It'll break my heart when he goes." "Now don't upset yourself. The General is only, what's he going to be, 45, 46. "How could you?" She pursed her lips, vigorously polishing the silverware. "The General was 47 in January. You were at his party, for God's sake," she continued to mutter as she fussed over the silver cruet. Mr. Flint looked kindly on his wife. As soon as he'd set eyes on her over 50 years ago, he'd never wanted to share his life with anyone else. In his eyes, she eclipsed everyone around her. There was nothing in the world he wouldn't do for her, but paying attention to the little details in her life was not his forte. There was only so much he could say before sounding completely insincere, and he didn't want to hurt her feelings. The greatest sadness in their lives had been not being able to have children. He'd accepted the fact and had plunged himself into his work with Scotland Yard. When he'd retired, they'd moved back down to Devon, just as he'd promised, and he'd watched her bloom on her native turf. When he'd been approached to take on the role of estate manager with her as housekeeper, the fit couldn't have been better. "How long is she staying for?" he asked. "Dunno, probably just a couple of hours." "Hardly seems worth it." She nodded towards the hall where Pilgrim and Haplin were duelling. "She got a new sword, that's why she's down." "I suppose she's in there with Haplin." "Who else? Course she's in there with Haplin. He's the only one what's any good." In the great hall, the clang of metal upon metal rang out. Swoosh! The tip of Haplin's sabre sliced through the air, passing within millimetres of Pilgrim's cheek. She was lithe and skilled, making her a very competent opponent. Anticipating its path, she instinctively leaned back, maintaining her foothold. Sweeping her left foot behind her and keeping contact with the floor, she moved her weight onto her back leg. With her sword in her right hand, she swung around with a seamless cantilever motion, catching him across the top of his left shoulder and noiselessly slicing the fabric open. Glancing down at the gaping hole, he opened his mouth to say something and promptly shut it. She allowed the corner of her mouth to rise slightly, knowing he would be kicking himself for such an obvious mistake. He eyed her speculatively, weighing her determination. He steeled himself for the next parry. Experience had taught him not to give her any margin. After all, he reminded himself, She wouldn't be lenient. He held a slim advantage in his long reach. His thin, sinewy frame, practiced in the art of balance, gave him a cat-like agility, matched with an economy of movement. Small hazel-brown eyes, set deeply under black bushy eyebrows, flickered discerningly over her limbs, calculating her next move. His mop of black hair bouncing this way and that as he rapidly slid back and forth to avoid any more damage to his clothing. Not fazed by her moving closer, he swirled down onto his haunches, deftly pulling a dagger from the back of his waistband. In one fluid movement, he drove it through the loose hem of her trousers, into the wooden floor, pinioning her to the spot. Using her free foot, she kicked the hilt, snapping it from the floorboard, whilst barely avoiding his upward slice. She arched her eyebrows in warning, but said nothing, as she shook the damp hair from her forehead. He responded with feigned surprise. "What, everybody plays nice in your world?" Standing with knees slightly bent and raising her arms, she tightened her fingers around the hilt. As her movements slowed, her eyes observed the rise and fall of his chest, as he caught his breath. In one swift stride, he swept past her, raising his sword and bringing it down against hers with a loud metallic splinter. Momentarily locked and freely perspiring, they braced themselves. Falling back, blades engaged, they rounded one another. Reversing her wrist, she twisted up, freeing herself, and swiftly cut down, bringing the razor-sharp tip dangerously close to his upper arm. He brought his blade crashing against hers. The vibration ran down her arm, dispersing. Taking a half step back, he capitalized on her losing her center of gravity as the momentum threw her shoulders forward. Using his upper body to gain more leverage, he pushed back, making her withdraw. Lunging forward, he found his mark in the crease between her right shoulder and upper chest. She let out a yelp, pulling free, whilst instinctively whipping her sword upwards. Before he could move himself beyond its reach, its tip caught him under his chin. He swore under his breath as he removed the back of his hand from the cut and looked at the smear of dark red blood. Ignoring the wound, he steadied himself. With a look of extreme menace contorting his features, he sprang forward as she swiftly turned to face his back and pressed the tip firmly between his shoulder blades. Immediately feeling its threatening presence, he became still, slowly raising his hands in defeat. Lightly touching her shoulder where his sword had pierced, she pulled her fingers away, examining the ends for any traces of blood. The cut was slight and only just beginning to seep through the padding of her tunic. Breathing hard, she carefully trailed the point of her sword down the back of his shirt until it rested on his right buttock, her eyes glittering brightly. He turned slowly, catching her sword's edge with his. Moving it to the side, he exhaled, "If you don't mind." She allowed her shoulders to slump from the exertion and smiled up at him, exhausted. "So, what do you think?" she added breathlessly, wiping back tendrils of hair with the back of her hand. She pulled back a scimitar and examined it admiringly. He reached for a dark towel from the back of the chair as he dabbed the small cut under his chin. "Try and keep that thing away from my face, or you'll have to find a new fencing partner, one that'll agree to your unorthodox practice methods." He reached over, lifting the hilt from her. Giving it a half turn, he examined it carefully. He moved his wrist in a circular motion, assessing its balance. Finally, spinning it in his hand, he made a slow, even arc, watching the blade. He marvelled at its symmetry. "It's a thing of beauty," he stated honestly. Handing it back to her, he pressed the towel to his chin. Pulling it away and seeing the crimson stain, he stated flatly, "I'll need to cauterize it." She frowned disbelievingly. "It's barely a scratch. I did need to christen it." She narrowed her gaze to search the carbon blade stretching out in front of her as she held it at arm's length. Lowering it to her side, its tip grazed the wooden floorboard at her feet. She carefully placed it in a case, snapping it shut. Hanging a towel around her neck, she approached him amicably. He put his hand up to stop her moving forward as he wet the end of a silver nitrate stick and applied it to the cut on his chin. He bent forward, clenching his fists. "Shit, that hurts," he rasped through gritted teeth, adding sarcastically, "Shoulder all right?" "Yes, thank you." She had the decency to look a little shamefaced. "I appreciate you seeing me at such short notice. You're about the only person worth going up against." "As I'm a little out of practice, I'll take that as a compliment. However, I should warn you, I won't be so accommodating next time." He eyed her case. "Especially if I have to put up with that." "Okay, forewarned is forearmed, although I must say I feel as though I have an unfair advantage." Her voice trailed off. Sensitive to her unusually light mood, he asked matter-of-factly, "How's work?" "Difficult." She suddenly looked tired and drawn. The overhead lights washed the colour from her pinched face. Picking up her sword case, she took the strap and began to swing it over her shoulder, abruptly stopping as pain shot through her. "I'm off to the habit. I could do with some liquid refreshment. Do you want to come?" he asked hopefully. "Sure, I'll shower and change. Meet you there in about half an hour?" Pilgrim drove down to Merrill Marquee, pulled up in the pub car park and entered the heaving bar. Seeing Haplin's head above the crowd, she pushed through the crush. "What'll it be?" he asked. "Thanks, a martini." He looked at her in amusement. "This is Merrillmar. Try again." Right, Plymouth and tonic, but tell him not to drown it." With the small pub filled to bursting, Haplin spied a friend and told Pilgrim he'd be back. With every bench, seat and alcove stuffed with those enjoying the rustic and lively atmosphere, she looked around for some space, finally deciding the pool table area would be as good a place as any. At least there was elbow room. She hadn't noticed Hansford enter the bar almost immediately after her and order a pint. He leaned against the wall, a sombre expression on his face, watching her. He needed to talk and had driven down from London after learning she was at Merrillmar. He'd been on his way up to her house when he'd spotted her car. Now he wasn't sure what he was going to say, but it would have something to do with him convincing her that they should share more than a physical relationship. He'd even had to spell it out to himself. He wanted her to be exclusive to him. He watched her easy-going affability with the locals as she laughed, slamming down £5 on the pool table and looking expectantly at the other players. She looked natural and inviting, with her hair left loose to fall around her shoulders. He noted her slim build in jeans and t-shirt only served to accentuate the curves of her figure. He wasn't the only one who was paying attention. As he scanned the faces of the men stood around the pool table, he noticed their interest in her. Her opponent, a well-built man with a ready smile, had an annoying habit of staring at her behind as she leant over to take a shot. She'd been forced to squeeze past him to gain access to the other side of the pool table, to which he'd raised his arms and grinned. Hansford's temper was up as he moved forward through the crowd towards them. Pilgrim was on form. After her session with Haplin, she banished the tension and anxiety she'd arrived with at Merrillmar. The alcohol she consumed was having the desired effect, and she was enjoying herself. After taking a shot, she looked up, surprised when she saw Hansford approaching. His set expression did nothing to dispel her happy mood. He looked determined and dangerous amongst the locals, but she'd soon disarm him. The last thing she wanted was conflict. She immediately went up to him. "Hansford, what brings you down here?" she smiled. "I had some business nearby and thought I'd drop in," he lied. "Let me finish this game and I'll buy you a drink." She was beaming up at him, her eyes sparkling. His senses went into overdrive as her pure scent assailed him. Who was he kidding? He didn't stand a chance. "This shouldn't take long." She expertly manoeuvred and potted the balls, quickly finishing to the groans of the onlookers who'd bet against her. As she handed her cue back, she scooped up her winnings. Her opponent came around the table, lifted her hand and kissed it. "It never felt so good to be beaten by a lady. What's your name?" He smiled at her. Hansford was furious, his jaw set hard. Pilgrim removed her hand, replying dryly, "You can call me Pilgrim." "Pilgrim, I'm Callum. Now, what do you say to another game? It's only fair, unless the first round was a fluke," he teased. Hansford immediately saw the challenge for what it was, a thinly veiled opportunity to get closer to her. He instinctively stiffened as he met the confrontational gaze of Callum. Physically, they were evenly matched, but he knew with certainty he could take them all on without breaking a sweat. Callum was now accepting Pilgrim's wager. She'd thrash him, and it would pain her to see a grown man cry, she'd laughed. Hansford spotted the lust in Callum's eyes. He was livid. How could she be so blind? He stepped forward, placing £20 on the table. "I say she does it in under 5 minutes. Bets were added to the table. Within the 5 minutes, she was picking up her money. Hansford watched Callum sidle up to her side, his intentions made clear by the look of undisguised interest on his face. "You've left me just enough to buy you a drink." Callum smiled disarmingly, moving his hands towards her arm. Snatching her snooker cue, Hansford shoved it into Callum's hand, his icy stare warning him to back off. "Excuse us." Hansford put his arm around Pilgrim's shoulder, steering her away. "That was a bit heavy-handed," she remarked. "Just a precaution. Your man there seemed to have something more than pool on his mind." "That's ridiculous," she dismissed the idea. "I thought I was pretty good, considering Haplin just knifed me in the shoulder," she added lightly. He hadn't been able to stop himself, as grabbing her waist, he pulled her round to face him. "He did what?" he hissed through gritted teeth. He ran his fingers expertly over her shoulder, examining it. She winced in pain. "You're hurting me." Her eyes rimmed blue, but instantly nullified. She couldn't understand the quelling effect his presence made on her true nature. "It was practice with my new sword. I expect, no demand, that Haplin doesn't hold back. Otherwise, what's the point?" "I'll tell you what the point is. You can get seriously hurt." She saw the look of concern in his eyes. Placing a hand gently on his cheek, she said, "Don't worry, Hansford. It'll take a lot more than that to bring me down." He caught her hand, placing a tender kiss on the inside of her wrist. She felt a leap of desire flame within her. Reading her response, he promptly turned her back around towards the bar. Picking up their drinks, she said, "Let me introduce you to my sparring partner." The smile she gave him melted through his body, causing him to feel protective of her. Drinks in hand above her head, she fought her way through the crowd. With his chest pressed against her back, he instinctively wrapped his arm around her waist to prevent her from tripping. He breathed in the smell of citrus and flowers from her hair, causing him to weaken. Seeing her approaching, Haplin put up his hand. Upon reaching his table, she placed their glasses down and made the introductions. "Haplin, this is Hansford, a friend of mine." Haplin wasn't fooled, even if Pilgrim was fooling herself. Just the look of possession that Hansford gave her meant he considered himself to be more than just her friend. "How's it going, Hansford?" Haplin shouted over the din. Hansford quickly assessed appeared fond of Neath, but nothing more. He relaxed. "Good. Thought I'd swing by and see how the other half live. Yeah, it's a bit mad in here tonight. End of the season's fishing. It's been a good year. That'd explain the level of testosterone in the air, Hansford concluded, deciding he was going to remain sober. Sorry, there are no chairs. We'll squeeze up, Haplin apologised. Even after they'd shuffled up, there was only one seat available. Hansford promptly sat down. I see the age of chivalry has died, Pilgrim laughed in mock horror. Hansford pulled her down onto his knee. Quit whining. He listened patiently as she and Haplin discussed swordsmanship. Her warmth and the soft fragrance from her body was leaving him breathless. He'd already decided he'd drive her back to Merrilmar. The flush in her cheeks and the brightness of her eyes told him she shouldn't get behind the wheel of her car. She seemed entirely oblivious to the primal needs she was evoking in the men around her. Evidently even Haplin wasn't immune, as Hansford watched him smile at her a little too indulgently. He decided they'd better get going. The noise in the pub had become deafening, and there was a distinct undercurrent that something was going to kick off before the night was done. Neath, I'll drive you back. She looked into his resolute eyes. She was having too good a time and wanted to remain. You go. I'm staying, she smiled. He knew on every front it was a bad idea. She was clearly intoxicated, not merely by alcohol, but by the heady excitement of being able to have fun. He didn't want to take that away from her, but he couldn't ignore the changing atmosphere in the bar amongst those men that didn't have their hands around a woman at that point. He'd been keeping tabs on Callum and the frequency with which he kept looking over at Neath. I don't think that's a good idea, he growled. I can take care of myself. Really? He unbalanced her off his knee, causing her to fall back against him. She stood up. That's not fair, she teased, threading her fingers through his hair. This was going to be harder than he thought. He pulled them away, kissing their tips. Now, Neath, he said firmly. You can't tell me what to do, she said, a note of seriousness underlining her reply. In an effort to prevent any further protest, he stood, lifted her chin and kissed her, making sure Callum, who was sat at the bar watching her, was under no illusions. Her response was immediate as she leaned into him. As his body betrayed him, she responded by curling her arms around his neck and pressing against him. Only the thought of him wanting more from her made him pull away. Let's go. Haplin, it's been instructional. Hansford smiled. As he navigated them towards the exit, she twisted away, turning around and shouting over to the barman, Bob, my keys! As the barman threw them in her direction, Hansford caught them, saying, I'll take these. Your behaviour is leaning towards the Neanderthal. Seeing Callum get off his bar stool and begin to head towards them, he added, Speaking of which... Hansford immediately slipped his arm around her waist, lifting her off her feet as he carried her outside and depositing her next to his car. Don't move, he warned. Sure enough, Callum came out, hesitating when he saw Hansford standing between himself and Pilgrim. Hey, Pilgrim, you're not going already, are you? He called out. Hansford stepped forward, saying pointedly, She's with me. Not from what I've heard, Callum replied, squaring his shoulders and standing firm. Get in the car, Hansford instructed Pilgrim. Hansford, this is the only pub for miles. Please don't hurt him, she pleaded. Don't worry about me, love. He'll find I'm harder to boss around. Callum looked threateningly at Hansford. Opening Hansford's car door, she quickly slid in, recognizing the situation was escalating. Maybe she doesn't want to go with you, Callum said angrily, stepping forward. Mindful of her request, Hansford stepped back, matched by Callum moving forward. Go back inside and save yourself the headache, Hansford warned. Callum leapt forward as Hansford, anticipating his trajectory, grabbed his arm, pulling it sharply up behind his back, and slammed his head onto the bonnet of the car. The impact made Pilgrim jump in her seat as she watched Callum slide off unconscious onto the ground. Hansford picked him up with ease, dumping him on a bench. Climbing behind the wheel of his car, he revved the engine and tore out of the car park towards the house. "Why can't we have normal?" she asked. "Because you're not," he bit out. "What, you think all that was my fault?" she asked angrily. "It's not, but men like him believe a woman alone is an easy target." "I wasn't alone," she protested. "He had the impression you're available, that there's nothing serious between us." He let his words hang in the air. Instead of her picking up on it, she said tiredly, "I need some fresh air." The pulse in her temples had begun to throb. "We'll take a walk once we're back at the house." Back at Merrillmar, a full moon lit the front lawn that ran down to the cliff edge. In the cold night air, with the sound of the waves lapping the pebble beach below, she stretched her arms over her head, taking a deep inhalation. Its effect made her sway. Removing his jacket, he placed it around her shoulders. "You should be going in," he said gruffly. She was in no fit state for the conversation he'd planned, and the last thing he wanted to do was argue. "You don't want to spend any more time with me?" she asked quietly. He wanted to blurt out how he really felt, that she was constantly invading his thoughts, how they should be a couple and stop sidestepping one another. But the thought she might turn around and say it was a bad idea kept him silent. Instead, he asked hopefully, "Why don't we meet up tomorrow?" "Why don't you come home with me?" she suggested enticingly. She moved towards him, laying her hands on his chest. She curled her arms around his neck. Stepping on tiptoes, she brought her lips to his. He lifted her up, kissing her deeply. Suddenly extricating himself from her embrace, he uttered with more assurance than he was feeling, "Oh, no, you don't." The hunger he saw in her eyes was unmistakable, and it took every ounce of his will not to succumb to his instincts and touch her. "Don't what?" She puzzled, annoyed. He'd again moved away from her. "Seriously, you cannot look that hot in front of me," he admonished. "Then do something about it," she invited. "You've been drinking," he offered as an excuse. "And?" "Neath, God!" Hansford ran his hand through his hair in exasperation. "I want more from you." There, he'd said it. She understood exactly what he was asking for, but she wouldn't place him in that kind of danger. "Being around me in that way is not conducive to a long and happy life," she stated honestly. The realization that she felt a serious relationship between them could put him in any danger caused him to laugh. He ran his thumb across her flushed cheek. "I've considered all the pitfalls, and I'm all right with it." Her anger flared as her eyes sparked. Was he an idiot? He might be okay with his sudden death, either at her hands or from something directed at her, but it wasn't okay with her. "But I'm not," she stated vehemently. "So Baxter's expendable, is he?" "Baxter is sacred to me. We have a connection that you wouldn't understand." As the words left her lips, she witnessed the fleeting pain in his eyes. "I understand," he stated flatly. "You and me, we share this." She moved seductively towards him, touching his arm and looking up as her lips parted. "Kiss me," she whispered. He couldn't stop himself. He'd meant to be tender, but everything he wanted for them, His hopes and then his frustration overrode him. She matched his passion. When it hit him this path only led in one direction, her bedroom, he fell back. His stubbornness and holding back only served to anger her. She badly wanted to tell him about the disarming effect he had on her nature, which could leave them both extremely vulnerable to attack. But as she couldn't even explain it to herself, she remained silent on the matter. She was determined to coerce him, if that's what it took to get him into her bed. She knew his will to withstand her was hanging by a thread. "I want you right now." She slowly trailed her fingers provocatively down her neck, across her breast to her waist. "Don't leave me like this." Hansford watched her mesmerized as his body responded with its own plans as he fought for control. Unconsciously, he took a step towards her. Reaching out, he grabbed her waist, pulling her to him. "Don't do this to me," he groaned thickly. "You don't want me?" Her heart sank. "I want you so much. It's physically painful. But nothing." Her anger peaked, with her true nature being submerged by his presence. She was kept physically helpless and frustrated beyond all reason. "You're not coming up to the house?" "No." "It seems neither one of us is prepared to give the other what we want. As far as I'm concerned, we're over." She turned, striding towards the house, yanking off his jacket and throwing it on the grass behind her. Watching her walk away, he knew he'd blown it.